Well, as we're recording this, Aotearoa New Zealand is taking a bit of a thrashing, and our hearts go out to those in the North Island and may even spread a little bit further in the next day or two. Our hearts are also continuing to go out to those in Ukraine and Eastern Russia, in Syria and in Turkey. But for our purposes tonight, thanks for joining me as we broke open the Gospel, Ordinary Sunday 7. We have Damon, Peg and Anne. We have a lot of challenges, I think, right from the start about something being fulfilled. But let's see, Anne, a bit of background on this passage.
This is the sort of passage you could talk about background for ages. I'll try not to make it too detailed, but I think there's two important types of context here. One is the general context of the fact that Jesus is talking to people in an occupied land. So these things about, getting backhanded by someone and having your coat taken off you and being forced to carry stuff, this isn't just theoretical ideas or pictures. This is reality for the people. And the other context is the context of each of those three situations that Jesus uses as illustrations. There's been a lot of work done into the background and context of these stories of cheek slapping and coat confiscating and walking the extra mile, most famously by a guy called Walter Wink, who asks why Jesus specifies which cheek is being struck. Because for a right-handed person to strike you on the right cheek, he would have to backhand you, which was a sign of ultimate contempt. If you present to him your other cheek, he's then going to have to hit you with the palm of his hand or with a fist, both of which will, of course, be painful, but do not carry with them the contempt that a backhanded slap does. So if you think last week about how stern Jesus was about one person calling another person fool, this is kind of almost a continuation of that from last week. That deserved the worst punishment in anything Jesus listed, probably because contempt is the foundation of injustice. So what Jesus is suggesting with these three stories is that there's a third way between retribution and submitting to injustice. And that third way is a non-violent, even loving challenge to and resistance of injustice. So just quickly, the other two situations, the coat situation comes from cloaks being offered as collateral for debt, and any poor man would only own 2 items of clothing. So if he gave the inner garment as well, now he's naked. And if you think of the story of Noah and Ham, his son, when Ham comes into the tent when Noah is naked, it is Ham who is shamed. And by doing this, the poor man is shaming the one who has taken away his cloak. And walking the second mile essentially meant forcing the soldier who told you to carry his pack for that mile to break the law. The law was he could only go for a mile. You carry it for 2 miles. Again, you're showing up injustice. And in case even this non-violent approach could sneakily become a way of getting at people, Jesus goes straight on to say it's about loving your enemies. So in essence, this passage is providing a third way between meek acceptance of abuse or injustice and escalating circles of vengeance, and saying that this is a resistance done in love, never to harm another, but definitely to change a situation.
Well, that's huge, a huge network of issues that Jesus is presenting us with, and thank you, Anne. So let's go to you, Damon, and ask where you find these things challenging.
I think one thing, just following on from what Anne's just said brilliantly, is that I just realised just how closeted my life really is. I've never really been the victim of a violent or an overly aggressive act. And so for me, these words make good sense, good theory. But what about for those people who have suffered injustices in one form or another? I mean, that's hard. And I think it's an incredibly critical challenge when you just think of what's happened in recent years with the mosque attacks in Christchurch. And what does that mean for those people who have suffered such brutal invasion into their lives, or what's going on in Ukraine at the moment? How do these words speak into that situation? So I find that challenging at that level. But the other bit is right at the end of this passage are those words, be perfect, therefore, as your Father is perfect. And I just sometimes feel, gee, I just want to give up. And it just seems like, come on, Jesus, get with the show.
So thank you. Yes, it's a fairly high bar to jump. So we're going to need some help somewhere down the line. We might explore that at some stage. Peg, for you, that's one big challenge. What about where are you finding it?
The challenge for me is just having to read these words, these really confronting, you have heard, but I say to you, the challenge of what I understand is that many different understandings of scripture were being followed at Jesus' time, the same as Christians do now. And then you have these words pointed out that it's not just this, but I'm getting you back to the heart of the law. And that makes it just so hard because then it's followed up by be perfect like your Father is perfect. That's incredibly challenging to find the love in the first place in this. But thank you for your background, Anne, because that does bring out the love.
It really does. But certainly no slick, polished, easy solutions to life here so far. And where do you find it personally challenging?
But a friend in Western Australia who works in nonviolent peacemaking, and one of my chaplains asked him when he was talking about it with them, does it work? And he said, well, no, not often. We don't do it because it works. We do it because it's right. And what the chaplain had been asking was, if I involve myself in nonviolent peacemaking, am I going to win? Am I going to have some sort of victory? Is the stuff I'm fighting for going to happen? And the fact is that an awful lot of nonviolent peacemakers in history have met very violent deaths, obviously. Within New Zealand, we have the story of Parahaka, but there's also Gandhi, of course, and Martin Luther King and Archbishop Romero. And so that's a huge challenge. Like you, Damon, I'm not dealing with that sort of high level stuff, but I am still daily dealing with people that I just like to get back at a bit, there are also big issues in the world. And so the challenge for me is, do I actually trust Jesus enough to do as he says? Or am I always going to try and find some reason why in this particular case I'm excused?
Well, you've just killed off the peacemakers for us, Anne. Let's see if Peg can rescue us and find some good news here.
Well, the good news comes on from Anne's, the whole idea that God's grace is present in this radical peacemaking, that the grace of God is that God's love is shown much more by doing these acts, by being the one who forgives, by being the one who is compassionate, by being the one who shows God's love in this moment. I also just found this today from Mother Teresa. She was attending a gathering with lots of people, and one of the noblemen spoke to her of her work with the poorest of the poor in Calcutta. He asked her if she didn't become discouraged because she had so few successes in her ministry, and Mother Teresa answered, "No, I do not become discouraged. You see, God has not called me to a ministry of success. He has called me to a ministry of mercy." And I think that that's the grace in this passage.
Thanks, Peg. Yes, that's a powerful saying and a powerful reflection. So, Anne, can you tease out some good news?
Well, I was given some good news to this passage by a visitor we had this week from the UK, a priest in the UK. He told us a story of a church that had a nightclub open across the road. And this meant that at midnight, all these teenagers rocked out of the nightclub and chucked stuff over the church wall into the church grounds. And it was all getting very difficult. And so they had their vestry meeting. And someone said, well, we need to build a bigger wall. And then two older women said, well, we don't actually sleep very much at night. So I think we should go and set up a table and offer coffee and cocoa to these people when they get out of the nightclub. And bless them, they did it. And they sat at this table and they served hot coffee and cocoa. And apparently within a couple of weeks, a bunch of the teenagers came to them and said, can we help you clean up the churchyard? So my challenge was that it doesn't always work. The good news is sometimes it does. And the good news is that there actually is generally a third way between getting angry, bringing the police in, building a wall, putting up with it. No, actually, let's try love.
And I'm reminded very much of a church that I knew of where a brothel opened up next door to the church. And unfortunately, the good news wasn't there in a sense. The church took legal action, but there was another possibility perhaps of caring for the women or whatever it might be. Damon, bring me some good news.
I think the good news is that there are some imperfect people that have trusted Jesus' teaching with their all. And I'm just thinking of someone like Nelson Mandela, after all that he went through, some words that he spoke. He said, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart." I just think those words are just so profound from someone who was the recipient of such vile actions against him. That love comes more naturally to the human heart. So that's good news for me. And the other thing too is I actually don't think Jesus asks us to be perfect. I really don't. I think it's a misreading of this verse. And maybe a better translation will be something like complete or whole. I don't know. Maybe even that's not quite getting to the essence of it. A bit like you, Michael, I'm a great Leonard Cohen fan. And those words from the anthem, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. It's also how the light gets out. And through our imperfections, our flaws in our lives, the light of God's love and mercy can shine. So that's good news.
And I'm reminded that, 2 weeks ago, we were having Jesus saying, you are salt. You don't have to go on an improvement journey to be salt. You're salt where you are now. So I get that. And I really appreciate you stressing that. Anne, can you perhaps give us an application?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I was going to come in and say, so my challenge is to do with this perfect thing as well. But fortunately, something I read in the last few days, points out that the word for perfect is telos. So it's the end goal. And this writer suggested that actually what Jesus is saying is we have to keep pushing on towards perfection. And so it's more of a perseverance type thing. Keep trying, keep pushing on to the goal, keep trusting that our lives are in God's hand and that Jesus knew what he was on about. And one little challenge within that for me, when I'm faced with all of the complexities of fighting injustice and complexities of working out what it actually means to love your enemies, we haven't really touched on that, but that's huge. I thought, well, one thing is to pray for them. And that's something you can actually just decide to do. This person who's irritating me or hurting me, actually, I can in the next week decide to pray for them. And that's one step towards the telos, and it's one step towards loving them.
And I think that sometimes begins with gritted teeth, but we still are challenged to keep going. Peg, can you extrapolate so what?
Well, that was mine too. Was that?
Sorry, Peg.
That's okay. Rather than pushing back, was the pushing on. Was that creates this radical peace place in the world, because I'm not pushing back. I'm not continuing. If I push, they're going to push back. And then we're going to keep escalating. So to push on and trying where we can to bring people with us is the grace and where I chose to be. I've had some tough times in my life. You may cut this out later. But I didn't want to be the woman who was bitter. I didn't want to be the woman who didn't forgive. And it took a lot. And that's where I learned not pushing back, but moving on and trusting. So
that's huge. That's really huge. So we're hearing something about a massive cost with the help of God, but
yes,
in breaking cycles.
But look where I am now. Look where I am now. So it's good.
All right. So Damon, to you for a final word as we explore a so what of a really difficult passage.
Let's not forget grace in all of this. When we're talking about be perfect, let's also remember grace. But I actually think celebrate your imperfection. That's what I'd want to say. Celebrate your imperfection. There's a lovely quote from Brené Brown, which for me gets the very heart of the gospel. She says, "You are imperfect. You are imperfect. You're wired for struggle. Yeah, we're wired for struggle. And you are worthy of love and belonging." I think that says it all.
Nothing to add to that, really. So thanks for being with me. This is breaking open a difficult passage in some ways, but a wonderful journey into teasing out its meaning. Damon, Anne, Peg, thanks for being on board.